Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we are stepping into a world shaped by steel, storms, and fate, a world where a single battle could decide the destiny of an entire kingdom. And at the center of that chaos stood a young warrior whose name would echo across centuries. Harald Sigurdsson. But before he became the feared Hardrada, before he marched under royal banners or commanded armies across continents, he was simply a 15-year-old boy standing beside his half-brother, King Olaf, preparing to reclaim a throne that had been taken from their family. Picture the scene, the cold Norwegian air vibrating with the sound of war cries, the distant hills answering with the roar of enemies closing in. King Olaf had returned from exile in the land of the Russ, determined to take back Norway from the powerful King Knut's supporters. And right beside him, sword barely fitting his growing hands, stood young Harald, driven not by title or glory but by loyalty, blood, and the belief that this battle might restore honor to their name. The two forces met at Stiklestad, a hillside that would soon be remembered in legend. Christians called upon their saints, pagans called upon the old gods, and the clash became a storm of shields, spears, and desperate hope. Amid the chaos, Harald fought with all the courage he could summon, but the battle quickly turned against them. King Olaf fell, struck down in the frenzy, and Harald, wounded and bleeding, had no choice but to flee into the wilderness. This moment, this fall from power, this escape into the unknown would not be the end of Harald's story. In truth, it was only the beginning of an incredible journey that would lead him across continents, into empires, and ultimately toward a destiny no one could have predicted. After the fall at Stiklestad, Harald's journey truly began, not as a prince, not as a commander, but as a wounded fugitive struggling to survive in a land suddenly filled with enemies. When the battlefield went silent and the cries faded into the distant woods, Harald rose from the ground barely alive. Blood soaked his clothes. Every step tore at the wound in his side, and the hills behind him were crawling with men loyal to King Knut, men who hunted the wounded, finishing what the battle had started. Harald had to disappear, or he would join the countless others who never left that hillside. Staggering through dense forest, he pushed deeper into the wilderness with nothing but a fading sense of direction and a stubborn will to live. The legends say he found shelter in a humble peasant hut, a small wooden cabin lit by firelight. Hidden between frozen trees, the family inside had no title, no riches, yet they offered him warmth, food, and the simple kindness that often outshines any royal gesture. There, in that flickering light, the future king of Norway lay near death, tended by ordinary people who had no idea how important he would one day become. But winter was coming, and the mountains of Scandinavia show mercy to no one. Harald could not stay. Wrapped in a red cloak to hide the blood and shield him from the cold, he set out again. A young peasant boy guided him toward the high passes, narrow paths, swallowing into snow-covered silence. Harald avoided main roads, crossed shadowy forests where travelers whispered of trolls and giants, and made his way eastward, step by painful step. Finally, after days that felt like years, he reached safer lands in Sweden. There, he found other survivors from Stiklestad, broken men with broken dreams, and together they prepared for something new, a journey to Kievan Rus, where Harald would rebuild his strength and his destiny. Reaching the safety of Kievan Rus was more than survival, it was Harald's first step into a larger world, one far beyond the fjords and frozen valleys of Norway. In the bustling courts of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, Harald found not only refuge but opportunity. Here, warriors from many lands gathered, each seeking wealth, redemption, or a path to future power. Harald arrived as a wounded exile, but the fire in him was unmistakable. Yaroslav had known Harald's half-brother, the fallen King Olaf, and he received the young prince with respect. Yet nothing was simply given to Harald. If he wanted to build a future, he had to earn it with steel, and so he did. Harald joined Yaroslav's armies as a commander of men hardened by loss. He fought in the marshlands of Poland, where battles dragged through mud thick as tar and enemies hid behind wooden palisades. He and his men burned hostile settlements, defended the borders of Rus, and carved their names into the memories of those they fought. With each campaign, Harald collected more than coin, he collected stories, scars, and the loyalty of warriors who believed in him. Despite victory after victory, Harald still lacked something crucial: status. He was brave, he was skilled, he was rising, but he had no land, no crown, and no fortune large enough to secure what he truly wanted: the hand of Yaroslav's daughter, Princess Elisaveta. Harald proposed. Yaroslav refused. A royal marriage required prestige, wealth, and a kingdom behind one's name, and Harald had none of those. So Harald made a decision that would change the course of his life. If Eastern Europe could not give him the power he sought, he would chase it farther south to the greatest empire of his age, a city of marble towers, golden domes, mighty gates, an endless opportunity. Constantinople. If Kievan Rus had shaped Harald into a warrior, then Byzantium, the shining heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, would transform him into a legend. Determined to win the wealth and status denied to him, Harald gathered a loyal band of Norse fighters and sailed south, drifting past quiet wooden towns, ancient rivers, and the long trade routes that connected to the cold north to the warm Mediterranean world. And then, rising like a dream of gold and stone, appeared Constantinople. To Vikings, this city was more than a place, it was a myth. They called it Miklagard, the great city, a metropolis so vast that its walls seemed to hold the sun itself. Its domes glowed with mosaics, its markets overflowed with silks and spices, and its streets were alive with languages from every corner of the known world. For men like Harald, it was the promise of everything they had ever fought for. Pushing through the crowded districts, Harald found his way to the imperial palace. There, beneath marble pillars and jeweled ceilings, he swore service to the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Norse and Rus warriors whose loyalty was prized above all else. To serve the Byzantine Emperor was considered one of the highest honors for a northern fighter. Harald quickly stood out, tall, disciplined, and fiercely ambitious. He earned a reputation not only for strength, but for intelligence, the kind of leader who could read a battlefield as easily as a map. The Byzantines valued him, the Varangians respected him, and the streets of Constantinople whispered his name long before he realized how far it would carry him. But Harald had not come only for glory. He had come for treasure, for influence, and for the kind of reputation that could move kings. And in Byzantium, he would soon find all three. Once Harald settled into the ranks of the Varangian Guard, his life shifted from the frozen forests of the north to the blazing coasts of the Mediterranean, a world of sunlight, desert winds, ancient fortresses, an endless conflict. The Byzantine Empire was vast, powerful, and always under threat. And for a warrior like Harald, that meant one thing: opportunity. The empire was struggling against waves of raids, launched by Muslim corsairs from Sicily and North Africa. Villages burned, families were taken captive, and the coasts trembled under constant attack. Harald and the Varangians were sent to answer that danger. They sailed aboard Byzantine warships, equipped with one of the most feared weapons of the medieval world: Greek fire. This fiery substance clung to anything it touched: ships, shields, armor, and burned even on water. As imperial ships closed in on pirate vessels, streams of blazing fire roared across the waves, turning battles into infernos. Harald and his men would leap aboard enemy decks in the chaos, swinging their axes in brutal close combat. But Harald's campaigns did not end at sea. He joined land operations across the Mediterranean frontier, helping retake towns, secure borders, and crush rebellions. He fought in Sicily, where he reportedly ended a siege by tunneling under city walls and defeating the guards from within. He traveled with an imperial delegation through the desert to the Holy Land, visiting Jerusalem's sacred shrines and fighting off bandits along the way. With each campaign, Harald grew richer: treasure from captured cities, gold payments from the emperor, and rewards for victories. His reputation soared. By his early 20s, he had risen to command portions of the Varangian Guard, respected and feared not just as a fierce fighter, but as a leader who never backed down. Yet as Harald's power grew, so did the shadows gathering inside the imperial palace: intrigue, betrayal, and a storm that was about to change everything. For all its splendor, Constantinople was a city built on secrets. Behind the golden mosaics, the marble courtyards, and the echoing hymns of its grand churches, power shifted like sand. And Harald, now a respected Varangian commander, found himself standing in the middle of a storm he did not create, but could not escape. The emperor at the time was Michael Iv, a man plagued by illness but protected fiercely by his wife, the powerful Empress Zoe. Rumors whispered that Zoe and Michael had risen to power through a sinister act: the sudden death of her previous husband, Emperor Romanos I. Whether true or not, the court believed it, and in Byzantium, belief alone was dangerous. As Michael's condition worsened, his nephew Michael V was adopted and placed next in line for the throne. But the younger Michael, though outwardly polite, was known by monks and courtiers as a man with a concealed nature, calm on the surface, calculating underneath. When Emperor Michael Iv died, Michael V ascended the throne. And immediately, paranoia wrapped itself around the palace. He distrusted the nobles. He distrusted the servants. He distrusted the Varangians, even Harald, whose loyalty had been proven in blood and battle. Worst of all, Michael V distrusted Empress Zoe, the very woman who had raised him to power. In a shocking act, he had her arrested, her hair cut, and exiled to a distant island to live as a nun. The people of Constantinople erupted. Zoe was beloved, and the citizens saw her humiliation as an insult to the empire itself. Riots surged through the streets. Crowds surrounded the palace. And when Michael V tried to restore Zoe to calm them, it was too late. The mob wanted justice. The Varangians, including Harald, joined the uprising, storming the palace gates, cutting down guards, and driving the terrified emperor into hiding. According to Norse saga tradition, it was Harald himself who dragged the fleeing emperor before the crowd and blinded him, an act that sealed Michael V's downfall and carved Harald's name into Byzantine legend. After the chaos in Constantinople settled and new powers took the throne, Harald knew his time in Byzantium had run its course. He had fought in deserts, crossed seas, crushed rebellions, protected emperors, and carved his reputation into the very stone of the empire. More importantly, he had achieved what once seemed impossible: wealth, enough treasure to fill dragon ships, enough silver and gold to rival kings, enough status to reshape his destiny. With this hard-earned fortune, Harald gathered his loyal Varangians and prepared to leave the empire he had served for years. He transported chests of coins, jewelry, rare silks, and valuables that marked him not as a wandering warrior anymore, but as a leader with true power behind his name. Men followed him not because he was Olaf's brother, but because he had proven, again and again, that he could bend fate to his will. His journey took him back to the lands of Kievan Rus, where he had once been a wounded exile recovering in the halls of Grand Prince Yaroslav. But this time, Harald did not return empty-handed. Not only wealth, but fame preceded him. In stories carried by travelers and traders, he was no longer simply Harald. He was the burner of the Bulgars, the feared Varangian commander, the man who had stood at the center of palace uprisings and walked away unbroken. With fortune and reputation secured, Harald finally won what he had sought years earlier. Yaroslav agreed to betroth his daughter, Princess Elisaveta, to the returning hero. Harald, once rejected for lacking status, now came back as a man worthy of royal blood. But he did not intend to remain in Rus. Harald carried a bigger ambition, something that had burned in him since the moment he fled Norway as a wounded boy. With treasure, allies, and a royal marriage behind him, he turned his gaze homeward. It was time to reclaim the throne of Norway. When Harald finally sailed back into Scandinavia, he did not return quietly. He returned as a man transformed, wealthy, battle-hardened, and determined to claim what he believed was rightfully his. But Norway had changed in his absence. His young nephew, King Magnus the Good, now sat on the throne once sought by Harald and Olaf. And Magnus, popular and generous, was not eager to share power with an uncle who arrived with ships full of gold and a reputation that could rival any king. Harald tried to negotiate. He reminded Magnus of their shared blood, of Olaf's legacy, of Norway's fractured past. But Magnus' advisors, especially old enemies of Olaf's line, rejected the idea of dividing the kingdom. They feared Harald's ambition, and for good reason. So Harald turned to another path. If Norway would not welcome him as a king, Scandinavia would feel his presence as a warrior. He forged an alliance with Svein Estridsson, the Danish claimant fighting against Magnus' rule. It was a bold, dangerous oath. Svein would take Denmark, and Harald would seize Norway. Together, they would unmake Magnus' control through sheer force. What followed was a storm of violence across the region. Harald and Svein launched raids on Denmark so fierce that even seasoned warriors called them merciless. Villages burned under their advance. Halls were torn apart. Fields were destroyed. Men were cut down. Women and children were taken as captives. To many, Harald returned not as a prince, but as a thunderbolt, unpredictable, unstoppable, and terrifying. These were not the swift raids of old Viking tradition. They were systematic campaigns designed to break loyalty, punish resistance, and force leaders to reconsider whom they truly feared more, Magnus the Good or Harald Hardrada. And as word of these attacks spread across the north, Magnus realized that negotiating with Harald might be the only way to prevent an all-out collapse of his kingdom. The devastation Harald and Svein unleashed across Denmark finally shook the balance of power in Scandinavia. King Magnus the Good, though admired for his fairness and generosity, understood one truth: Harald was not a rival who could be ignored. He commanded veteran warriors, carried unimaginable wealth from Byzantium, and possessed a claim to the Norwegian throne through blood. If Magnus refused to deal with him, the land risked sliding into endless war. Behind closed doors and through secret messengers, Magnus and Harald negotiated. The result was unprecedented. Norway would have two kings. Magnus would remain the senior ruler, while Harald would share authority and receive a portion of the royal income. It was a fragile peace, one built on shaky trust and clashing personalities, but it held just long enough to reshape the kingdom. Yet the tension between them never disappeared. Magnus, beloved by the people, viewed Harald as overly harsh and unpredictable. Harald, in turn, considered Magnus softer ruler who cared too much for goodwill and too little for strength. The courts exchanged sharp words, subtle provocations, and simmering resentment. Still, duty forced them into cooperation, especially while the threat of Svein lingered in Denmark. Then, in 1047, everything changed. Magnus fell gravely ill during a campaign and, in his final moments, named Harald the sole king of Norway while granting Denmark to Svein. But Harald was not a man guided by the final wishes of others. With Magnus gone, he moved immediately to seize both authority and opportunity. Back in Norway, Harald asserted his rule with firm resolve. He expected loyalty, obedience, and order. Some chieftains submitted, others grumbled. A few dared to resist. Harald noted their names, and he would soon deal with each of them in his own way. For the first time in his life, Harald sat on the throne he had chased across continents. But winning a kingdom was only the beginning. Keeping it would require something far more brutal. Harald's rise to the throne did not bring peace, it unleashed a storm. Norway was a kingdom in name, but behind the title lay a patchwork of powerful families, ancient loyalties, and regional chieftains who had survived generations of shifting rulers. To Harald, these men were not merely nobles, they were potential rivals, and a king who had fought his entire life to reach the throne would not allow rivals to grow. Harald ruled with an iron certainty. Where Magnus had been forgiving, Harald was unyielding. Where Magnus had won hearts, Harald intended to break resistance. His message to Norway was simple. A kingdom divided cannot stand, and he would be the one to unite it, no matter the cost. One of his greatest obstacles was Einar Thambaskilfar, a powerful chieftain who openly challenged Harald's authority. Einar had long opposed Olaf's family, and did not hide his disdain for Harald's harsh methods. But Harald was patient in his own way. Rather than strike immediately, he invited Einar to a meeting under the guise of reconciliation. Einar entered the dimly lit chamber and remarked, "It is dark in here." It would be the last thing he ever said. Harald's hidden men emerged from the shadows and killed him on the spot. When Einar's son rushed forward to defend his father, he too was cut down. The message was unmistakable. From that point forward, Harald crushed dissent with terrifying efficiency. Regions that resisted, whether through rebellion or even hesitation, found their halls burned, their lands confiscated, or their leaders removed. Rumors spread that Harald had even taken offerings placed at the shrine of Olaf, his own brother. Whether true or not, the people whispered it with fear. Yet even as he built churches and strengthened the kingdom's wealth, Harald's rule earned him a single unforgettable name: Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, a king who demanded order, punished betrayal, and never softened his grip. But even this iron-fisted rule could not silence every threat. Beyond Norway's shores, another old enemy remained. Even after years of tightening his grip on Norway, Harald Hardrada was not satisfied. A man who had fought across continents was never meant to sit quietly on a throne. And when fate delivered a new opportunity, one wrapped in politics, betrayal, and the promise of a foreign crown, Harald answered without hesitation. The spark came from Tostig Godwinson, a disgraced English earl. Once the ruler of Northumbria, Tostig had been driven out by his own people and replaced by his brother, Harald Godwinson, the man who would soon become King of England. Exiled, bitter, and hungry for vengeance, Tostig sailed across the seas seeking allies. And who better to approach than the most feared ruler in the north? Tostig reminded Harald of a long-standing claim. Years earlier, Magnus Harald's nephew had inherited a supposed right to the English throne from King Hardicanute. When Magnus died, Harald inherited that claim. It was thin, political, and wrapped in old alliances, but to a warrior like Harald, it was enough. Combined with Tostig's offer of support, it became a call to destiny. Harald began gathering an invasion force, unlike anything England had seen in a generation. Around 10,000 warriors, ferried by fleets of longships that darkened the coastline. His soldiers were veterans Varangians, Russ, Norwegians, men shaped by raids, campaigns, and distant wars. When Harold's fleet approached England, its scale alone struck fear into coastal towns. Many surrendered immediately, others resisted, and those who stood against the Vikings soon faced burning homes and fierce battles. Harold pushed inland, moving toward the powerful city of York, where English forces attempted to halt him, but were defeated in a brutal clash near the marshlands. With victory secured, Northumbria agreed to surrender and offer hostages in exchange for peace. Harold believed the path to the crown was opening. But Harold did not know that King Harold Godwinson was marching north at impossible speed, and that this campaign would lead him to one of the most famous battles in English history. For a moment, it seemed as if Harold's gamble might succeed. Northumbria had yielded, the nobles had agreed to surrender hostages, and the Vikings believed they were only one step away from securing a foothold in England. On the morning of September 25th, Harold left a large portion of his army behind at their ships and marched towards Stamford Bridge with 2/3 of his forces, many without their mail armor, because the weather was unusually warm. But what Harold did not know was that King Harold Godwinson had performed one of the most astonishing forced marches in medieval history, traveling nearly 200 miles in just a few days. As Harold's men waited near the river, expecting a peaceful exchange, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was the English army, fully armed, fully ready, and closing fast. The Vikings scrambled into formation. A lone warrior famously held the narrow bridge, delaying the English advance with furious resistance until he was finally brought down. But the real battle unfolded on the field. Harold rode before his men, reminding them that courage mattered more than armor, that this was the moment to prove their strength. The shield wall clashed. Arrows flew. The earth shook under charging cavalry. For a while, the Vikings held their ground, their discipline and experience resisting the English onslaught. But as the line shifted and gaps opened, chaos erupted. In the heart of the fighting, Harold fought with fierce intensity, so relentless that sagas say no shield or armor could stand before his blade. Then, in an instant that would echo through history, an arrow pierced his throat. The death of Harald Hardrada shattered the Viking line. Tostig fell soon after. Reinforcements arrived too late. Only a fraction of the fleet returned to Norway. 3 days later, Harold Godwinson himself would fall at the Battle of Hastings, ending the Anglo-Saxon era. But Harold's death ended something even larger: the age of Viking invasions. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, died as he had lived in battle, chasing a crown across the edge of the world. And so, when we look back across these 12 chapters of Harald Hardrada's life, we see far more than the story of a single warrior. We see the rise and fall of an entire age. Harold begins as a wounded boy fleeing into the forest, carrying nothing but courage and the memory of a fallen brother. Yet that same boy crosses continents, becomes a trusted commander in the greatest empire of his time, amasses fortunes, wins a princess, and returns home determined to carve his destiny into the cold stone of Norway. His reign is marked by brilliance and brutality, a king who builds churches with one hand and crushes rebellions with the other. He punishes rivals, burns villages, and imposes order through fear. To his supporters, he is the firm hand the kingdom needs. To his enemies, he becomes the figure whose very name, Hardrada, means the hard ruler. But Harald is never content to rule only one kingdom. His final ambition pulls him across the sea toward England, guided by old claims, new alliances, and the promise of yet another crown. He wins battles, conquers towns, and forces powerful nobles to kneel. For a moment, it seems the world might bend to him once more. Then Stamford Bridge changes everything. In that unexpected clash, Harald faces an enemy he did not anticipate. On a day he thought would bring peace. The arrow that ends his life also ends the era of Viking conquest, closing the door on centuries of raiding, expansion, and northern power that once shook Europe. Harald Hardrada's story is the final blaze of the Viking flame. Fierce, ambitious, and unforgettable. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoy journeys into history's most dramatic moments, do not forget to stay curious. Share your thoughts below, and join me again for the next story.